My name is Rosa Vidal. I am 63 years old, and for most of my adult life I believed that a family built on love was its own kind of inheritance. I was wrong. I don't say that bitterly, not anymore. I say it the way you state a fact you tested for a long time before you finally accepted it, the way you accept that a door is locked only after you've tried the handle enough times to know the mechanism is broken, not just stiff. My husband Ernesto and I met when I was 24 and he was 31. He had a small trucking company then, 2 vehicles, a rented lot in the eastern edge of Tucson, and the kind of certainty about the future that I had never seen up close in a man before. My own family had been cautious people. Careful. Ernesto was different. He saw distance as inventory. He said that once, early on, when we were driving back from a delivery run I had ridden along on just to spend the afternoon with him. Distance is inventory, Rosa. Every mile is something waiting to be converted. I wrote it in my journal that night because I thought it was the most interesting thing anyone had ever said to me. I worked alongside him from the beginning. Not as a figurehead, not as a supportive presence standing in the background of photographs. I kept the books for the first 11 years because we couldn't afford an accountant we trusted, and by the time we could, I knew the accounts better than anyone we might have hired. I handled vendor contracts. I negotiated fleet expansion agreements personally, sitting across laminate tables in conference rooms that smelled like burned coffee, while Ernesto ran the yard. By the time our children were in school, the company had 17 vehicles. By the time our eldest, Marco, graduated high school, it had grown into a regional operation with contracts across 4 states. We had acquired warehousing properties by then, and Ernesto had begun investing in commercial real estate on the side. I raised 3 children in that house on Crestfield Drive in Tucson. Marco was the eldest, then Daniela, then our youngest, Tomas, who arrived late enough that Marco was already in middle school when he was born. I drove them to school and to practice and to their friends' houses. I volunteered at the elementary school for 6 years. I cooked dinner most nights of their childhoods, sat with them through fevers and bad dreams and the particular misery of adolescence. I also, during those same years, continued to manage the company's vendor relationships, reviewed every major contract renewal, and handled the insurance negotiations after we lost 2 vehicles in an accident in 2004, a process that took 8 months and required me to learn more about commercial liability coverage than I had ever intended to know. I am telling you this because by the time the events I am about to describe took place, I had spent 39 years constructing something, a business, a family, a life, and I had made the mistake of assuming that the people I had built it alongside understood what my contribution had been. When Ernesto died, the estate was distributed to our children. I received a sealed envelope with my name on it in his handwriting. Think about the last time someone in your family assumed your effort didn't count. I want you to hold that feeling because what happened next in my house took that assumption and built a legal structure around it. Ernesto's health began to decline in the winter of his 68th year. It was gradual at first, the kind of slowing that looks like ordinary aging until a diagnosis arrives and reframes everything. He had a cardiac condition that his cardiologist managed well for 2 years, and then managed less well, and then, in the spring, stopped being able to manage at all. He died on a Thursday morning in April in our bedroom with me beside him. He had been home from the hospital for 9 days. I did not fall apart. I want to be clear about that. I grieved, and I am still grieving in the way that doesn't announce itself, the kind that surfaces when you reach for someone in a dark room and remember again that the room is empty. But I did not collapse. I made the calls that needed to be made. I sat with the funeral director and made the arrangements. I called Ernesto's attorney, a man named Gerald Pratt who had handled the company's legal work for over 20 years, and I told him we would need to meet about the estate. What I did not know in those first days was that Marco had already called Gerald Pratt before I did. The reading of the will took place 12 days after the funeral, in Gerald Pratt's office on the 4th floor of a building downtown that always made me think of waiting rooms, beige walls, framed prints of the Arizona landscape, chairs that were comfortable enough to sit in but not comfortable enough to forget why you were there. Marco arrived first. He was 41 by then, broad-shouldered in the way Ernesto had been, with the same habit of standing slightly apart from a group as though he were already evaluating it. Daniela came in behind him. She was 38, and she had driven up from Phoenix the night before and stayed at Marco's house, a detail I learned incidentally, the way I learned most things in those days, which was by noticing what was not offered to me directly. Tomas arrived with me. He was 29 and still lived in Tucson, and he had picked me up from the house that morning without being asked. Gerald read through the preliminary documents with the practiced neutrality of a man who had delivered difficult news before and had learned to let the words carry it rather than his face. The company, the full operating business, restructured under a holding entity Ernesto had created 7 years earlier, had been divided between Marco and Daniela in a 70/30 split. Marco received majority control. The commercial properties went into a trust administered by Marco as primary trustee, with Daniela as secondary. The personal accounts, the vehicles, the residential investments, itemized, allocated, distributed in language that was precise and complete and left very little to interpretation. My name appeared twice in the main document. Once to acknowledge me as surviving spouse, and once to note that I would receive the contents of a specific item described only as a sealed envelope, currently in Gerald's possession, to be given to me at the conclusion of the reading. Gerald slid the envelope across the table when he finished. It was a standard legal envelope, the kind with the metal clasp, and it had been sealed with tape along the flap. My name was written on the front in Ernesto's handwriting. I picked it up and held it. Marco spoke first. "Mom," he said, and his voice had that particular quality I had learned to recognize over the years, the one that sounded like patience but functioned like management. "We want you to know that we've already been in touch with a financial advisor. We're going to make sure you're taken care of. You won't have to worry about the house or your expenses." I looked at him. "I wasn't worried," I said. "Of course." He nodded as if I had agreed with him. "But this is complicated and we want to handle it correctly. Dad built something significant. It requires people who understand that kind of," he paused, choosing the word with visible care, "complexity." I set the envelope down on the table in front of me. "I helped build it," I said. Daniela leaned forward slightly. She had her mother's eyes and her father's precision, and she used both of them now. "Rosa," she said. She had called me Rosa since her late 20s, a shift I had noticed but never addressed. "We're not dismissing what you did. You were an incredible support to Dad. But the business side of things, the legal structure, the holdings, that's a different thing. We think it's better if you let us manage that." An incredible support. As though I had been a very good assistant. As though the 11 years of bookkeeping and the vendor contracts and the insurance negotiations and the 3 warehouse lease amendments I had personally redrafted in 2011 were the contributions of someone who had been helpful around the edges of something her husband had built without her. I squared the papers in front of me and said nothing. Gerald wrapped up the procedural details. Signatures were needed. There were follow-up meetings to schedule. Marco was already on his phone before we stood. Daniela touched my arm briefly on the way out, a gesture that might have been affection and might have been something else, and said they would call me that week to go over the transition timeline. Tomas walked me to my car. He didn't say much, which was his way. At the car door he stopped and said, "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine," I told him. He looked at me the way he had looked at me since he was a child, the particular attention of the youngest, who had watched his older siblings more carefully than they ever knew. "What's in the envelope?" I looked down at it in my hand. "I don't know yet," I said. "I'll open it at home." That night, sitting at the kitchen table with the overhead light on and the house quiet in the way it had been quiet for 12 days, I opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. Plain white. Ernesto's handwriting again, careful, slightly cramped, the way he wrote when he was being deliberate about something. There was a bank account number. A routing number. The name of a bank I recognized, a regional institution we had used early on before the business grew large enough to require a different infrastructure. Below the numbers, one line. "This is for the woman who always loved me truly." And below that, a second line, smaller. "Check the balance, Rosa. Then call Pratt. He knows what to do next." I set the paper down on the table. My throat tightened, the way it had not in the 12 days since Ernesto died, not at the funeral, not at the reading, not in any of the practical conversations I had moved through like someone completing a checklist. It tightened now in the kitchen alone, looking at his handwriting on a plain white page. I did not check the balance that night. I wasn't ready. I folded the sheet back along its creases and put it in the envelope and set the envelope under my address book in the kitchen drawer, and I went to bed. I want to be honest about when the dismissal started, because it did not begin with the will reading. That moment in Gerald Pratt's office was the formal version of something that had been accumulating for years, a pattern so gradual that I had, for a long time, mistaken it for ordinary family friction. The first time I noticed it clearly was the summer Marco turned 35. Ernesto had brought him into the business in a meaningful way by then, genuinely transitioning authority, giving him the title of operations director, letting him lead the quarterly reviews. I understood the reasoning. Ernesto was 62 that summer, and succession planning was appropriate. I supported it. What I did not anticipate was how quickly Marco's authority over the business would reshape how he understood the history of it. We were at a Sunday dinner at Marco's house, the kind we had been doing for years, rotating between the kids' homes once they had them. There were 6 of us at the table, Marco and his wife Elena, Daniela, Tomas, Ernesto, and me. The conversation had turned to the warehouse properties, specifically, a lease renegotiation coming due on the larger of the 2 facilities. I mentioned in passing that the original lease terms had been structured with an early termination clause I had pushed for in the 2009 renegotiation, because I had been uncertain about the market trajectory and wanted the flexibility. Marco looked at me across the table. "I don't think that clause came from the 2009 round, Mom," he said. "I pulled those docs when I was reviewing the portfolio. I'm pretty sure that was in the original lease." "It wasn't," I said. "The original lease didn't have it. I added it in 2009. "I just reviewed those documents," he said again, with the patient firmness of someone correcting a minor error. I picked up my glass and said nothing more about it, and the conversation moved on. But after dinner, in the car driving home, I told Ernesto what Marco had said. Ernesto was quiet for a moment, then said, "He doesn't know what he doesn't know yet." "He was very certain about it," I said. "He'll learn," Ernesto said. But he didn't. Not in the way Ernesto meant. The second incident was at a contractor appreciation dinner, the kind we had hosted every 2 years at a hotel ballroom downtown. I had organized these dinners since the beginning: the vendor list, the catering negotiations, the seating arrangements, the printed programs. The year I am thinking of, Marco had taken over the planning coordination for the first time, and I had stepped back deliberately, because stepping back was what you did when you were trying to support a transition gracefully. Afterward, one of our oldest vendors, a man named Carl Huerta who had been supplying us with parts since the early days, found me near the exit and shook my hand. "Mrs. Vidal," he said, 30 years of these dinners. You always made everyone feel like the most important person in the room." Before I could respond, Marco appeared at my elbow. "We're trying some new things this year," he told Carl. "Modernizing the approach." Then to me, with his arm briefly around my shoulder in a gesture that managed to be both affectionate and dismissive, "Mom's been a great resource for the historical context." Carl looked at me. I looked at Carl. I capped my pen and set it down on the nearby table and said, "It was a lovely evening." Historical context. 30 years of organizing, negotiating, managing, showing up, compressed into that phrase, as though I were an archive rather than a participant. Over the years before Ernesto's death, I had done the following things for the business and for our family. I had renegotiated the primary vendor contract in 2007, saving the company an estimated $40,000 annually for 3 years. I had managed the workers' compensation claim process through 2009 and 2013, navigating 2 separate disputes that our insurance carrier had initially declined. I had reviewed and marked up every lease amendment on every commercial property we owned, 4 properties, 12 amendments over 15 years. I had handled the insurance renegotiation after the 2004 accident for 8 months, resulting in a settlement that our attorney later told me was 20% above what he had expected. I had organized every contractor appreciation dinner for 26 consecutive years. For the family, I had managed the household finances for 39 years. I had been the person both Daniela and Marco called first during their divorces, separately years apart, and I had sat with each of them through those seasons without complaint. I had taken Tomas to every medical appointment he needed from birth through his mid-20s, because he had a chronic condition that required consistent monitoring, and managing that care had required its own sustained attention. None of this was exotic. It was the texture of a life built alongside another person, and it had been absorbed so completely into the background of our family that my children had come to understand it as the scenery rather than the structure. Daniela's version of the dismissal was quieter, more clinical. She called me 2 weeks after the will reading as she had said she would. She explained in the organized way she explained everything, that she and Marco had met with a property management firm and were going to begin transitioning the commercial properties to professional management. That makes sense, I said. We also, she said with a slight pause, want to think carefully about the family home. The property taxes on Crestfield are significant, and with the estate restructuring, it might be more practical to consider whether it makes sense for you to be in a house that size alone. Daniela, I said. I understand what you're suggesting. And I'd like to finish opening the estate before we have that conversation. Of course, she said. I just want you to be thinking about what's realistic. What's realistic? As though the house I had lived in for 27 years, that I had managed and maintained and filled with the daily work of raising a family, were a logistical consideration to be optimized. I said I would be in touch, and I ended the call, and I sat for a while in the kitchen with my hands flat on the table. 3 weeks after the will reading, I called Gerald Pratt. I had checked the balance by then. I had done it on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop and the sheet of paper Ernesto had left me, and I had typed the account number into the bank's online portal and waited for the page to load. The number I saw was not small. I sat with it for a long time before I did anything else. Gerald's assistant put me through quickly. Gerald himself came on the line with the careful warmth of someone who has been waiting for a call and is relieved it has arrived. Mrs. Vidal, he said. I'm glad you called. The account, I said. Tell me what Ernesto intended. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he came to me 4 years ago. He said he wanted to create something separate, outside the main estate structure, outside the holding entity. He was specific about that. He wanted it to be yours alone, not subject to the estate distribution, not accessible to or known by the other beneficiaries. And the children don't know about it, I said. They were not informed, Gerald said. That was his explicit instruction. I thought about Marco in the conference room, explaining that he would make sure I was taken care of. I thought about Daniela's careful voice on the phone, suggesting I consider what's realistic. There's more, Gerald said. Ernesto left me a separate letter of instruction, to be opened only after you contacted me following the estate reading. He wanted you to open the envelope, read it, and come to your own decision before I told you anything further. He said, and I'm reading from the letter now, she'll know what to do with it. She always did. My chest did something I wasn't prepared for. I pressed one hand flat against the table. What's in the letter of instruction? I asked. Documentation, Gerald said. Quite a lot of it. Records Ernesto compiled over the last 4 years, vendor contracts you negotiated, lease amendments you drafted, insurance settlements, the appreciation dinners, financial management records going back to the beginning. He documented it formally with supporting evidence in a way that could be introduced in a legal context if necessary. I was quiet. He also retained an attorney specializing in estate disputes, Gerald continued. Her name is Patricia Osei. He retained her 18 months before he died, on the anticipation that the estate distribution might be contested, or that the distribution itself might need to be contested by you. He thought they would do this, I said. Not a question. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He knew his children, he said. He loved them. But he knew them. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was bright with the particular flat light of a Tucson afternoon. The bougainvillea along the back wall was the same deep red it had been every spring for 27 years. I thought about Marco's voice in the conference room. We want to make sure you're taken care of. I thought about Daniela suggesting I consider whether a house that size was realistic for a woman alone. I thought about the contractor dinner and Carl Huerta's face when Marco called me a historical context. Tell Patricia Osei I'll meet with her, I said. I'll set it up, Gerald said. Mrs. Vidal, I want you to know that what Ernesto built for you here is significant. It is not a consolation. He was very clear about that. I know, I said. And then, because it was true and because I had needed to say it out loud to someone for 3 weeks, he always saw what I did. I closed the laptop after we finished the call. The envelope was still on the table in front of me. I picked it up and held it the way I had held it in Gerald's office, with both hands feeling the slight weight of what was inside. 48 hours later, Marco called. His voice, when I answered, had the specific register of someone who had received information they had not anticipated and had not yet decided how to manage it. Mom, he said. Gerald Pratt's office just notified us that there's an additional legal matter connected to Dad's estate. They said you've engaged an attorney. A pause. Is there something we should be talking about? I looked out the window at the bougainvillea. Yes, I said. I think there probably is. We can all sit down together, Marco said, and now the management register was stronger, the patience that functions like control. As a family. Whatever's going on, we can handle it together. I'll be in touch about timing, I said. After I ended the call, I went to the kitchen drawer and took out the address book and the envelope. I put both of them on the table. Then I sat down, opened my laptop, and began writing a list, not for anyone else, not yet, but for myself. A list of everything I had done in order from the beginning. I wrote for 2 hours. When I stopped, the list was 4 pages. I looked at it for a long time. Then I folded it in half and set it beside the envelope and went to make coffee, because there was still a great deal of work left to do, and I had always worked best when I wasn't rushed. Patricia Osei was 51 years old, compact and unhurried, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending 20 years in rooms where people are trying to unsettle each other. She had reviewed everything Gerald provided her within a week of our first meeting, and she had spent the following 2 weeks adding to it, pulling company filings, cross-referencing vendor records, requesting documentation from the holding entity that Marco now controlled. When she called to tell me she was ready, her exact words were, "Mrs. Vidal, I want you to understand what we're walking into that room with before you decide how you want to use it." I told her I understood. "Good," she said. "Then let's schedule the meeting." Marco arranged it as a family sit-down, as though we were resolving a scheduling conflict or deciding where to spend the holidays. He booked the conference room at a hotel downtown, Neutral Ground, which I found interesting. It suggested he had thought about the optics more than he wanted me to know. They were already seated when Patricia and I arrived, Marco at the head of the table, Daniela to his right, and a man I didn't recognize to his left who turned out to be their attorney, a younger man named Brent who had the careful posture of someone hired recently and still proving himself. Tomas was there too, at the far end of the table, and when I came in he looked at me in the way he had looked at me outside Gerald's office, with the particular attention of the youngest, waiting to understand what was actually happening. Patricia set her briefcase on the table and opened it without ceremony. She produced a manila folder and set it in front of her, and then a second one, placed both at a precise angle. She did not open them. Marco looked at the folders, then at me. "Mom," he said, "before we start, I want to say that whatever legal steps have been taken, we can work through this as a family. That's all any of us want." "I appreciate that," I said. "Dad left the estate the way he did for reasons," Marco continued. "We've been over the documents. The structure was deliberate. He built the holding entity specifically to consolidate the business assets, and the distribution reflects." "Marco," I said. He stopped. "I know what the distribution reflects," I said. "I'd like Patricia to walk us through what she's put together." Marco looked at Brent. Brent gave a small, non-committal nod. Patricia opened the first folder. "I'm going to be straightforward," she said, "because that's the most efficient use of everyone's time. Over the past 6 weeks, I've compiled documentation relating to Rosa Vidal's contributions to the business and assets that constitute the estate. What I have here is a formal record, vendor contracts, lease amendments, insurance negotiation correspondence, financial management records, covering 39 years. Most of these documents exist within the company's own files. Some were preserved separately by Ernesto Vidal with the specific purpose of making them available in a proceeding like this one." Daniela's expression didn't change, but she set her pen down. Patricia reached into the folder and produced the first set of documents, placing them on the table one at a time. "The 2007 vendor contract renegotiation," she said. "Rosa's signature is on the amendment. The savings to the company over 3 years are documented in the annual accounts." She placed a second set. "The 2004 insurance negotiation, 8 months of correspondence. The settlement was 20% above what the company's own attorney projected. Rosa handled this process directly and without assistance." A third set. 12 lease amendments across 4 commercial properties. Rosa reviewed and marked up every one. In 3 cases, her revisions changed material terms. Marco was looking at the documents. His jaw had a particular set to it that I recognized, the same set it had when he was a teenager and had been caught in something and was calculating how to respond. We're not disputing that Rosa contributed, he said. That's not what this is about. What is it about then? Patricia asked with genuine curiosity in her voice. The estate was structured by Dad, Marco said. Legally. With counsel. What's in front of us doesn't change the legal distribution. No, Patricia said. These documents don't change the distribution. They establish the basis for a separate claim, a claim of equitable contribution. Which is a different thing. She produced the second folder. Ernesto Vidal retained me 18 months before his death to advise him on exactly this question. He understood that the estate distribution as structured might be challenged by the primary beneficiaries, and he wanted the documentation in place to support Rosa's independent position. She set the folder on the table. He also funded a separate account outside the estate. You've been notified of this through Gerald Pratt's office, which is not subject to challenge because it was never part of the estate to begin with. The room was quiet. Brent leaned toward Marco and said something low. Marco listened, then looked at me directly. Mom, he said, and now the management register was gone, replaced by something rawer. Did you know about this account before Dad died? No, I said. But you knew he was doing this. Building a case. I did not, I said. I found out the same way you did. After. He sat back. He looked at the documents spread across the table. For a moment he looked his age, not 41 with the authority of operations director, but 41 with the specific expression of a man who had made a calculation that had turned out to be wrong. It was Daniela who spoke next. She had been quiet through Patricia's presentation, and she had the particular stillness of someone who processes quickly and doesn't show the processing. She looked at me across the table. We said you were a support to Dad, she said. We didn't mean it the way it sounded. You meant it exactly the way it sounded, I said. I want to walk through it if that's all right. I've been thinking about it for a while. Nobody told me not to. At the will reading, I said, Marco, you told me the estate was complex and required people who understood complexity. I had spent 39 years managing the financial infrastructure of that estate, including the books for the first 11 years before we could afford an accountant. I understood the complexity. What I didn't have was a title. Marco didn't respond. At Carl Huerta's dinner, I said, you told Carl I had been a great resource for the historical context. I had organized that dinner for 26 consecutive years. I negotiated the catering contracts. I managed the vendor list. I printed the programs. What I was the reason the evening worked. What you called me was an archive. Daniela was looking at the table. And Daniela, I said, you called me 2 weeks after the funeral and suggested I think about whether a house that size was realistic for a woman alone. I had lived in that house for 27 years. I had maintained it, managed it, made every repair decision, paid every bill. The question of whether it was realistic for me was not a practical question. It was an instruction to start making myself smaller. The room held the particular silence of people who have heard something true said plainly. I want you to understand what I was doing during those years, I said. While you were growing up and after. I renegotiated the primary vendor contract in 2007 and saved this company $40,000 a year for 3 years. I navigated 2 workers' compensation disputes that our insurance carrier declined and won both. I reviewed every lease amendment on every property your father ever owned. I managed the 2004 insurance claim for 8 months and settled it 20% above projections. I organized the contractor dinner for 26 years. I paused. I also raised 3 children, one of whom needed medical monitoring from birth that required consistent attention for 25 years. And I managed that without ever describing it as a burden or asking for acknowledgement. Tomas at the end of the table looked down at his hands. I am not telling you this to relitigate the estate, I said. Patricia has the legal matter in hand, and that process will run its course. I am telling you this because you are my children, and I would rather you understand what you dismissed than have you find out from documents in a conference room what your mother actually did. I picked up the folder Patricia had set in front of me. I set it back down. Then I stood. I'm going to go home now, I said. When you're ready to talk, not to manage me, not to explain what's realistic, but to talk, I'll be there. I picked up my bag. Patricia closed her briefcase. We walked to the door together and I did not look back, and I did not let the door close hard behind me. In the corridor, Patricia walked beside me without speaking until we reached the elevator. Then she said quietly, "That was well done." I had a long time to think about what I wanted to say, I told her. It showed, she said. The fallout came in pieces over the following weeks, the way fallout usually does in a family, not as a single event but as a series of adjustments. Marco called 3 days later. His voice had lost the management register entirely. He sounded tired and younger than he had in years. He said he had gone back through the company files after the meeting and had found the 2009 lease amendment I had mentioned at his dinner table 6 years earlier. The one he had been certain wasn't there. He had read it twice, he said, and he could see my notes in the margin. He didn't apologize directly. Marco had never found direct apologies easy. But he said, "I think I didn't understand what you were actually doing all those years. I thought I did, but I was looking at the wrong part of it." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry, Mom." And then he said it again, which told me it had cost him something to say it once. Daniela took longer. She was precise about her processes and she needed time to complete them. She came to Tucson 6 weeks after the meeting, and we sat in the kitchen the way we used to when she was in her 20s and coming to me with problems she hadn't solved yet. She said she had been thinking about the phone call she had made 2 weeks after the funeral. The one about the house. "I was managing the situation," she said. "That's what I do when I don't know what to feel. I manage." "I know," I said. "I should have asked how you were." "Yes," I said. "You should have." We sat with that for a moment, and then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine and I let her. Tomas had said almost nothing in the conference room. But the week after, he appeared at the house on a Saturday morning with coffee from the place on 4th Avenue that I had always liked, and he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "I always knew, Mom. I want you to know that. I always knew what you were doing." "I know you did," I said. "I should have said it out loud more." "We all should have done things differently," I said. "That's what families are for, I think. To give you enough time together to eventually get it right." The legal matter resolved, as legal matters eventually do, through the kind of structured negotiation that is less dramatic than a courtroom and more durable. Patricia was thorough. The documentation Ernesto had compiled was specific and well organized, which I found, honestly, both moving and characteristic of him. He had always believed that precision was a form of respect. What was established in that process was not a redistribution of the estate but a formal recognition, with financial weight attached to it, of the contributions I had made. The account Ernesto left me remained mine entirely. The outcome was not a reversal of everything. It was something more modest and more real, an acknowledgement with evidence that the work had been done. I think about Ernesto often, in the way you think about someone who is gone but not absent, present in the shape of a room, in the particular way light comes through a window you both looked out of for decades. I think about the note he left in the envelope. The account number, the routing number, and one line: "This is for the woman who always loved me truly. And then she'll know what to do with it." She always did. He saw me. He had always seen me. And at the end, when he could not be there to say it in person, he built something that would say it after him. What I learned, not from the meeting, not from the documents, but from the long months of sitting with all of it, is that invisible work is not the same as unimportant work. It only feels that way when the people around you have confused what they can see with what exists. I had spent 39 years doing things that kept a family and a business intact, and I had done them without needing them to be visible, because that is how I was built. But there is a difference between not needing recognition and accepting erasure. I confused those two things for too long. The bougainvillea along the back wall of the house on Crestfield is the same deep red it has always been. I sit in the yard some evenings and I look at it, and I think about the distance Ernesto said was inventory, every mile something waiting to be converted. I think he meant something larger than trucking. I think he was talking about time and effort and the long accumulation of things done quietly over years, and the fact that nothing real is ever truly lost. It just waits to be counted. If there is something worth carrying from what happened to me, it is this: the people who do not see your work are often not cruel by nature. They are simply looking somewhere else. But looking somewhere else is still a choice. And at some point, the person whose work has been invisible has the right to turn on the light. I am glad I turned on the light. I am glad Ernesto left me a way to do it. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know who in your life is sitting with an unopened envelope and hasn't yet decided what to do next. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, and events are fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or situations is coincidental.